The year is 1856. On the European shores of the Bosphorus, the air smells of sea salt and fresh masonry. If you were a foreign diplomat attending the grand opening of the Dolmabahçe Palace, you would be forgiven for thinking you were standing in the heart of a thriving, invincible superpower. You would walk up the famous crystal staircase, shaped like a double horseshoe, where the banisters are made of baccarat crystal rather than wood. Above you hangs a gift from Queen Victoria, a 4.5-ton chandelier, the largest in the world, shimmering with 750 lamps. Everywhere you look, there is gold. Not gold paint, but 14 tons of gold leaf painstakingly applied to the ceilings to reflect the candle power. Sultan Abdülmecid I stands at the center of this opulence. He has abandoned the ancient, mysterious Topkapi Palace for this neoclassical marvel. His goal is simple: to prove to the West that the Ottoman Empire is not the sick man of Europe, but a modern titan, civilized and wealthy, worthy of sitting at the table of great powers. If you could peel back the gold leaf and look at the ledger books beneath, you wouldn't see wealth. You would see a tragedy of arithmetic. To build this fantasy, the empire didn't use surplus tax revenue. It didn't use the spoils of conquest. For the first time in its 600-year history, the Ottoman state was financing its existence on the global credit market. That crystal chandelier? It wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of the chain tightening around the empire's neck. The champagne flowing at the reception was bought with loans from the very French and British bankers sipping it. The empire had begun to sell its future revenue streams, its taxes, its tolls, its sovereign independence, for a quick injection of cash. They were building a palace with a credit card, swiping again and again, believing that if they just looked rich enough, the bills would never come due. But in the shadowed corners of London and Paris, the accountants were already calculating the compound interest. They knew what the Sultan did not. The Dolmabahçe was not a seat of power. It was the most expensive collateral in history. The sick man had put on a golden mask, but underneath he was already bleeding to death financially, and the creditors were gathering at the gates, not with swords, but with fountain pens. To understand why a drowning man would buy a heavy golden coat, we must look at the panic in his eyes. Sultan Abdülmecid I was not simply a hedonist losing his mind. He was a ruler terrified of extinction. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the predator of the Mediterranean. It was the prey. The Russian bear was clawing at the northern borders, and internal nationalist movements were setting fires in the Balkans. The Sultan's logic was tragic but clear. Survival required westernization. This was the era of the Tanzimat, the reorganization. The court believed that if they adopted European laws, wore European frock coats, and lived in European palaces, the British and French would feel compelled to protect them as one of their own. The construction of Dolmabahçe was, in essence, a massive diplomatic PR campaign. It was an attempt to project power where none existed. But beneath the modern frock coats, the empire's body was rotting. While the Sultan was importing Italian architects, his revenue system remained stuck in the Middle Ages. The empire relied on tax farming, a disastrous practice where the state auctioned off the right to collect taxes to private individuals. These middlemen paid the treasury a lump sum up front and then squeezed the peasantry for every last kurush to make a profit. This meant the central government had almost no control over its own cash flow. Roughly 40% of the tax revenue extracted from the people never even reached Istanbul. It vanished into the pockets of corrupt intermediaries. So, when the bills for the modernization efforts arrived, the vault was empty. Enter the Galata Bankers. These were the local intermediaries, the fixers in the district of Istanbul where East met West. They whispered the solution that would seal the empire's fate. If you cannot tax your people, borrow from your friends. The stage was set. On one side, a sultan desperate to buy respectability and security. On the other, European financiers sitting on surplus capital from the Industrial Revolution looking for high-yield investments. They didn't see a sovereign nation, they saw a distressed asset. The British and French governments encouraged these loans, not out of charity, but out of strategy. A debtor Ottoman Empire was a controllable Ottoman Empire. They were about to hand the Sultan a lifeline that was actually a leash. The board was set, the pieces were moving, and the empire was about to make its first transaction with the devil. The trap didn't snap shut with a roar of cannons, but with the polite scratch of a pen in 1854. To fund the Crimean War, the empire signed its first foreign loan. It was meant to be a temporary measure, a bridge over troubled waters. Instead, it became the foundation of a financial Ponzi scheme that would make modern scam artists blush. Here is how the transaction actually worked, a mechanism designed to ensure the debtor could never truly escape. When the Ottoman treasury issued a bond, they didn't get face value for it. To attract wary European investors, they sold their debt at a massive discount. For every £100 of debt the empire signed for, they might only receive £50 or £60 in actual cash. Pause to consider the brutality of that arithmetic. The Sultan was paying interest on £100, but only had £60 to spend. The missing £40 evaporated instantly into commissions for the banks in London and Paris. Before a single brick was laid or a soldier paid, the empire was already underwater. To pay the interest on the first loan, they had to take out a second. To pay the second, a third. The interest rates weren't just high, they were predatory, often effectively doubling what other nations paid. But the Sultan had no leverage. He needed the cash to keep the lights on at Dolmabahçe. And what did the creditors demand as collateral? They didn't want promises. They wanted hard assets. They laid claim to the empire's actual revenue streams. The tribute payments from Egypt, the customs duties from the ports of Izmir and Syria. These were no longer flowing into the Ottoman treasury. They were ring-fenced, earmarked directly for the bondholders. The empire was effectively selling off chunks of its own geography. Then came the ultimate Trojan horse, the Imperial Ottoman Bank. Established in 1863, it sounded patriotic, it sounded local. It was anything but. It was a private institution owned by British and French shareholders, yet it was given the exclusive right to print Ottoman currency. Think about that. The empire had outsourced its own central bank. The power to control inflation, to manage the money supply, and to dictate economic policy was no longer in the hands of the Sultan. It was decided in boardrooms in London and Paris. By the early 1870s, the transaction was complete. The Ottomans weren't borrowing to build railroads, factories, or schools. They were borrowing solely to pay the interest on previous lies. The economy had become a hollow shell, and the fuse on the dynamite was burning short. The loans were the poison, but the capitulations were the shackles that prevented the patient from reaching for the antidote. To understand why the Ottoman Empire couldn't simply work its way out of debt, you have to look at the markets of Istanbul. By the late 19th century, a bizarre legal reality had taken hold. The empire was trapped in a series of ancient treaties known as capitulations. Centuries ago, when the Ottomans were strong, these were generous grants of privilege given to European traders. But now, in the age of weakness, they had mutated into a weapon of mass economic destruction. Imagine a marketplace in Istanbul. On the left is a local Turkish merchant selling textiles woven in Anatolia. On the right is a French merchant selling fabric mass-produced in Lyon. The Turkish merchant is drowning in taxes. He pays internal transit duties just to move his goods from the village to the city. He pays income tax. He pays tithes. The French merchant? He pays almost nothing. Under the capitulations, European traders were effectively immune to Ottoman law. They were exempt from most local taxes. If they committed a crime, they couldn't even be tried in Ottoman courts. They answered only to their own consuls. It was a state within a state. While the rest of the world was using high tariffs to protect their infant industries, the way America and Germany did to catch up to Britain, the Ottomans were legally forbidden from doing so. They were forced to keep their borders wide open. Cheap, mass-produced European goods flooded the empire, crushing the local guilds. The smoke from British factories didn't just signal progress in London, it signaled the death of the loom in Anatolia. The empire underwent a process of deindustrialization. They were forced back into the role of a raw material supplier, exporting cheap wool and opium while importing expensive finished goods. The structural trap was complete. The government was desperate for revenue to pay the bankers in London, but they had legally exempted the richest people in their cities, the foreign merchants, from paying taxes. This left only one option: squeeze the peasantry harder. The tax collectors became vultures. They took the seed grain, they took the farm animals. This destroyed the agricultural base, which was the only thing keeping the economy alive. By trying to pay the interest, they cannibalized the means of production. The empire was no longer a sovereign entity. It was a captive market, a landlord who had handed over the keys to his tenants and was now begging them for rent. The system was rigged so that every attempt to stand up only tightened the knot. The house of cards didn't just fall. It was incinerated by a spark from halfway across the world. In 1873, the Vienna Stock Exchange crashed, triggering a global financial panic that ripped through London and New York. Suddenly, the tap was turned off. The European investors, now terrified and risk-averse, stopped buying Ottoman bonds. The credit card was declined. At the exact moment the foreign cash flow stopped, nature turned cruel. A devastating drought swept through Anatolia in 1874, followed by a harsh winter and floods. The tax base, the starving peasantry, collapsed. There was no gold to borrow, and there was no wheat to tax. In October 1875, the inevitable happened. The Grand Vizier issued an announcement that froze the blood of every financier in London. The empire was insolvent. The government declared it would only pay half of the interest due on its debt in cash. The other half would be paid in IOUs. It was a default in all that name. The value of Ottoman bonds plummeted. The illusion of the wealthy westernized empire shattered instantly, revealing the bankrupt skeleton beneath. The European powers did not send gunboats, at least not yet. They sent accountants. After a brief, disastrous war with Russia that further emptied the treasury, the Sultan was forced to sign the Decree of Muharrem in 1881. This document was effectively the empire's surrender of its economic sovereignty. It created the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA. This was not a government ministry. It was a foreign corporation operating on Ottoman soil, accountable only to the bondholders in Europe. It was a hostile takeover. The OPDA was given absolute control of the empire's most lucrative revenue streams, the taxes on silk, spirits, salt, and stamps, as well as the fisheries. The OPDA built its own massive headquarters in Istanbul, a building that physically looked down upon the city. They hired their own staff, eventually employing over 5,000 agents who were more efficient, better paid, and more powerful than the Sultan's own tax collectors. When a fisherman in the Bosphorus caught a fish, he paid a tax not to his Sultan, but to a clerk working for British and French bankers. When a merchant bought a stamp, the money went to Paris, not the treasury. The Ottoman government had been reduced to a municipal council allowed to manage the sewers and the streetlights, while the foreign creditors managed the wealth of the nation. The sick man of Europe was now on life support, and the machine was owned by his enemies. History is often written in blood, but the obituary of the Ottoman Empire was written in red ink. By 1914, the sick man of Europe was no longer just sick. He was a zombie. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration, OPDA, had become so efficient, so pervasive that it was arguably the only functioning part of the state. While the Sultan's soldiers went unpaid and hungry, the European bondholders received their dividends with clockwork precision. Nearly 30% of the entire empire's revenue was being siphoned off solely to service debt. This financial suffocation dictated the empire's final, fatal move. Why did the Ottomans join World War I on the side of Germany? It wasn't just about territory. It was a desperate gamble to break the chains. Britain and France were the debt collectors. Germany offered a tantalizing promise of debt relief and investment. The empire went to war not to conquer, but to escape the bankruptcy court. They lost the gamble. The empire was dissolved, carved up by the very powers that had financed its extravagance. So what is the final lesson of the Dolmabahçe Palace? Today, tourists walk through its gilded halls, marveling at the crystal staircase and the 14 tons of gold leaf. It is undeniably beautiful. But for the historian of power, it stands as a grim monument to a fatal geopolitical error: the confusion of consumption with modernization. The Ottoman elite believed that if they bought the products of the West, the palaces, the uniforms, the ships, they would become a Western power. They failed to understand that power comes from production, not purchase. By outsourcing their economy to foreign bankers and their industry to foreign factories, they sold their sovereignty for a facade of progress. They built a palace to show the world they were kings, but in doing so, they signed the contract that made them servants. The ultimate tragedy is that the credit card bill was eventually paid, but not by the sultans. It was paid by the generations that followed, through the collapse of a civilization, the loss of territories, and the painful birth of a new nation that had to fight tooth and nail just to regain the right to print its own money. The Dolmabahçe remains a glittering warning to developing nations everywhere. True independence is not declared on a balcony. It is secured in the ledger.